welcome once again to bread baking. For this time, I'm going to be making something that's called Jamaican hard dough bread. The reason that I'm going to be making it is because it's what's called a very low hydration bread. Normally when people make breads, they want to make them very high hydration, and that gives you that more open crust, open crumb structure, and generally people tend to like the taste more. But I also like lower hydration breads, mostly because they're easier to, and less messy to work with. But there are other reasons. So when I decided I wanted to make this, originally I had made this a while ago because a gentleman I work with is Jamaican, and he said, and when he discovered that I baked, he said, "Oh, can you make hard dough?" I'm like, "What is hard dough bread?" So I looked it up. Turns out it is in fact a thing, and it is actually a really, really good sandwich bread. It's a soft, fairly dense but not stodgy loaf of bread, and it is pretty heavily enriched. So that's the other thing that I want to talk about while I'm making this, is enrichment and what it does and what it's for. So basically what I did was I Googled a number of recipes and took a look at them, and I converted everything. When you get the recipes, they do cups of flour and cups of water and teaspoons of this, and in order to make it look like bread, at least and I'm used to seeing with a bread formula, I went and converted everything into what's called baker's percentages. And remember when I talked about you set the amount of flour equal to 1 and do everything as a ratio of that. That's what's called baker's percentages. So when I did that, I picked the first 3 recipes I found when I Googled, and I found that the 3 recipes had varying amounts of sugar, from 11% to 1%. They had different kinds of fat, but they had the same amount. So they were 10% fat. One of the recipes was a mixture of vegetable oil and margarine. The other one was butter, and the other one was margarine. So we've got 10% fat, and we need to decide what kind we want to put in there. Water was consistently 50%. Which makes sense because you're making a low hydration bread. You want it to be denser and less airy, so it makes sense that the water's low. And then the other difference is that the salt was between 0.5% and 1%, so very low salt. So I'm going to just kind of split the difference. I'm going to go 10% butter. I'm going to put in a little bit of sugar. But the other thing is that gentleman I work with who's Jamaican is absolutely obsessed with raisins. So rather than just making a Jamaican hard dough bread, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a bread with a raisin, cinnamon, sugar spiral in it. So when I'm done, I'm going to roll the bread out, I'm going to cover it with raisins and cinnamon sugar, and then I'm going to roll it and then put it in my tin and then bake it. But that's going to be the next one. So basically what we're looking at is 454 grams of flour, which is, there you go, 1 pound of flour. The other thing about it, I've talked about flour, I've talked about water, I've talked about salt, yeast. The Jamaican hard dough breads call for lots of yeast, like 4 spoonfuls of yeast. And the reason is they also call for warm water versus, room temperature, tap water, whatever. And the reason for that is they're trying to kickstart the ferment. You want this bread to be made very quickly. Since we are currently in the coronavirus lockdown and it's sometimes hard to find yeast, what I'm going to do instead is just put in a little bit of yeast, and then I'll come back tomorrow morning when the bread has risen and put the filling in and bake it. So just for now, I'm going to just get everything set up to start off. So we've got 454 grams, 1 pound of flour. We've got, I'm going to do it this way. So that's about 53 grams of butter, which is a little bit higher than it has to be. It's, 11%, 12% butter. That's okay, we'll have a little extra butter in this. Next, I'm going to take a look at the salt. And And 1% salt means we're going to be putting in about 4 grams of salt as opposed to 9 that we would put in for a normal loaf of bread. So let's see, 4 grams. Alright, there we go. That was 4 grams. That was a kind of a light spoonful of salt. Flour, water, salt, yeast. Okay. The other thing is sugar. The recipes do call for a little bit of sugar. This is a very enriched loaf of bread, so I'm going to add a little bit of sugar. I could go anywhere from 1% is 4 grams all the way up to 10%, which is 45 grams. I'm going to kind of shoot down the middle. I'm going to go with about 10 grams of sugar. Okay, no, I'm not. I'm going to go with 16 grams of sugar because that's how much a spoonful was. But that's okay. That's, you know, within range. The other thing is that because I'm going to be making this with a sugar filling, I don't really need to go all the way up to 10% sugar because there's going to be a sugar filling in there as well. And then the last thing that I'm going to do is add a cup of water. So again, a cup of water is half a pound of water is 50% hydration, which is exactly where I'm at. So I've got all of my components together. I'm going to mix them. I'm going to put them in the proofing drawer, and I'm going to let them sit overnight. So I'm going to pause here, and tomorrow we'll come back and we'll take a look at the proofed bread. You know, after we do what's called the bulk ferment, then we're going to roll it out, add the filling, put it back in for a second rise, and then bake it. So until tomorrow, I'll see you then. So I let the dough sit overnight, and you can see it's formed a bit of a crust. You can see there's the lighter and darker streaks here when I stretch it. That's just because I left it sitting overnight. It does not really make the dough that bad, but I'm just going to kind of fold it and roll it to try and break the crust up and incorporate it. You can't see this, but this is a very soft dough, but it's also relatively stiff, so which is about what you'd expect for hard dough. So the next step at this point, now that I've done a little bit of kneading on the dough, is I'm going to roll it out about the width of a loaf pan. So about that wide. And just roll it out. And this is actually the way you're supposed to make the hard dough bread, just by rolling it out like this. Try to be prepared to get the sugar out now. The sugar is in the way. And normally, you would take this and then roll it into a tight spiral, throw it in the loaf pan, let it rise again, and then bake it. As I mentioned, I'm going to do something a little bit different, and I'm going to put a filling in it before I roll it up and put it into the loaf pan. And the filling I'm going to use is cinnamon raisin, because you know, cinnamon raisin is just one of those classic flavors. Okay, so check. Yep, still about as wide. So, get the sugar, about a quarter cup of sugar. For those of you keeping track, that's about a quarter of a cup is about 10%. A quarter of a cup of sugar weighs about 50 grams, so it's a 10%. And then a teaspoon of cinnamon, I'm going to mix the cinnamon and sugar together briefly. You can see adding a sugar filling like this, why I wasn't really worried about how much sugar I was putting in the dough, because I was about to cover it with cinnamon sugar anyway. Okay, so I've got a good even layer of cinnamon sugar on this. I have a cup of raisins. I'm also going to spread across the top of it. Okay, cinnamon sugar, raisins. Roll it up, put it in the loaf pan, and here you go, one loaf of bread. What I'm going to do next is give it its second rise, so hour, maybe an hour and a half in the proofing drawer, and then bake it for 40 minutes at 350. That's what the recipe calls for. All of the recipes said, 30 to 40 minutes at 350 for this particular kind of bread. So that's what I'm going to do. And when we come back again, we will have a loaf of bread and we'll open it up and we'll take a look at how it came up. See you then. Alright, so we're all done here, and that particular bake did not, as they say, go according to plan. You can see the loaf here did not get a good rise off of that, which I kind of suspected was going to happen because I didn't. I should have done more time on the second rise, but I didn't. Sometimes the dough can be hard to rise too, so that's okay. But cut open the middle and we'll see how it looks. So, yeah, just looking at it, the raisins came out very nice. It's hard to see, but you can tell in the middle here with a different texture. If you press this, this actually feels more like dough than if you press out here. It feels like cooked bread. So didn't cook all the way through, which is okay. Didn't rise as well as I like, but the good news is it's going to be edible and will probably taste pretty good. So live and learn. It was a good experience. And so the lesson here that I'm taking away from this is that when you have a heavily enriched bread, this had a lot of butter in it, had sugar in it as well, that's going to inhibit the growth of the yeast, and if you actually get high enough, you might even end up killing your yeast, so you won't get any rise at all. We did get a little bit of a rise, but because the growth was inhibited, I should have given it a lot more time, or as the recipe suggests, added a lot more yeast at the beginning. I didn't, but it's okay. I still have good bread to eat. So, thanks very much, and we'll see you later.